The world's most expensive spirit is made from a plant that can take up to 30 years to bloom, which it does only once and then dies. The industry built around it generates over $3 billion a year in exports, and is built around a monoculture clone that's vulnerable to the exact same kind of fungal collapse that already wiped out the world's most popular banana. This plant was sacred enough to kill a goddess for, important enough that unauthorized consumption was punishable by death, and so central to one civilization that the country they built may have been named after it. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're covering agave, a plant that's been feeding, clothing, sheltering, and intoxicating the Americas for over 10,000 years, and that the modern spirits industry might be destroying. Its story starts with a creation myth so brutal, it makes Greek mythology look tame. The genus agave belongs to the asparagus family, making it more closely related to hostas and yucca than to any cactus, despite what every desert movie has ever implied. There are over 200 species, and roughly 75% of them are endemic to Mexico, making it one of the most concentrated centers of plant diversity for a single genus on the planet. Agave plants are monocarpic, meaning that the plant flowers only once in its lifetime and then dies. Depending on the species, that single bloom might come after 8 years or 30. The plant spends all of that time accumulating carbohydrates in its massive core, called the piña, then sends up a flowering stalk that can reach 10 meters, about 36 feet, and that's it. Everything it had, given in one glorious act, which is kind of similar to the corpse flower, another plant we've covered. This life cycle earned it the English folk name the century plant, which exaggerates the timeline, but nonetheless captures the patience. For the Nahua peoples, the civilization that built the Aztec Empire, this monocarpic sacrifice inspired a brutal origin myth for this plant. And there's also a myth about agave involving a drunk possum, though it's not origin myth specific. I just need to talk about it in a second. The first one goes like this. The fertility goddess Maiawell, known as the woman with 400 breasts, was imprisoned in the sky by her grandmother, Tzitzimeltal, the most fearsome of the star demons. The wind god Quetzalcoatl ascended to the heavens, fell in love with Maiawell, and convinced her to descend to earth, where the two of them transformed into a double-branched tree to hide, but Tzitzimeltal found them. She tore Maiawell's body to pieces and fed the remains to her legion of star demons. Quetzalcoatl, stricken with grief, gathered what was left of Maiawell's bones and buried them in the earth. And from those remains, the first maguey sprouted. Its thick leaves and sweet sap, the goddess's body, reborn to sustain humanity forever. So Maiawell becomes the divine representation of agave, and when the Nahua people call her the woman with 400 breasts, it's more of a reference to maguey's ability to produce sap for months than just, like being excited about boobs. Maiawell's children, the Sensantatochchin, the 400 rabbits, were a pantheon of rabbit gods, each representing a different way a human being can act while drunk. One represents joyful dancing, another melancholic weeping, belligerent arguing, quiet contemplation, the list goes on. The Nahua looked at the spectrum of intoxication and thought each one of those is clearly a different deity possessing you, which, tracks. Okay, now possums. In another story, the possum god Tlaqualche was tasked with carving the courses of Mexico's rivers. While foraging, he discovered an agave, dug into its leaves, and lapped up the fermented sap. He got so impossibly drunk that when he stumbled off to carve the riverbeds, his lurching, weaving path gave Mexico's rivers the winding, sinuous courses they have now. So if you ever looked at a map of Mexico and wondered why the rivers curved so much, the Aztecs put the blame on a drunk possum. In Nahuatl, the word for agave is metal, and it's embedded in dozens of compound terms. Mezcali, meaning cooked agave, is the root of the modern word mezcal. Aguamiel, honey water, is the name for the sweet sap. And one theory, which, to be fair, is still debated, claims the word Mexico itself derives from metal plus shikti, meaning navel, plus co, place. So Metzalshikti-ko is the place at the navel of the agave. Archaeological record puts humans and agave together for at least 9,000 years, based on remains we found in the Ocampo caves in Tamaulipas, Mexico. While in Colima, we found circular subterranean stone structures found in both residential and ceremonial contexts dating from 200 to 1500 CE that are identical to modern agave roasting ovens. Linguists have reconstructed a dedicated word for agave in Proto-Amerindian, one of Mesoamerica's oldest language families, dating to at least 7,000 years ago, placing it alongside words for maize, avocado, and prickly pear as culturally important enough to warrant its own term that early. The 16th century Florentine Codex, the great encyclopedia of Aztec life, documents just how much agave was central to their lives. Fibers from it were woven into cloth and rope, spines were used as needles and ritual bloodletting tools, leaves processed into paper, stalks used as construction beams, sap consumed as medicine, and fermented into the sacred drink octli, which we'll get into in part 2. Agave plants use a special type of photosynthesis called crassulation acid metabolism, or CAM, which means that they open their stomata at night to absorb CO2 and close them during the day to conserve water. This makes agave extraordinarily drought-resistant and capable of thriving in conditions that would kill most crops, which is why it's probably stuck around with us for so long and has been such an important crop for so many people. So it makes sense that in the Oaxaca valleys, Zapotec farmers discovered that in many semi-arid areas, agave was actually more productive than maize and far less dependent on rainfall. The plant that survives where nothing else will, unsurprisingly, outperforms conventional crops when conventional crops are going to struggle. The Hohokam people of Arizona engineered riverine terraces and rock pile fields specifically for agave dry farming, creating over 550 documented cultivation sites. In 2023, a landmark study in the Annals of Botany identified 6 pre-contact agave domesticates cultivated by the Hohokam, including species that are distinct from both the wild Southwest agaves and Mesoamerican species. Since agaves reproduce primarily through asexual cloning via offsets, clones of these Hohokam cultivars are still growing in the Arizona landscape today. That might not be enough to save the agave industry, but we'll get to that later. The people who relied on agave carried its name into their own identities. The Mescalero Apache of the American Southwest are named directly for it. Mescalero derives from Mezcali. The Hopi maintained an agave society known as the Kwakwant, one of their traditional men's ceremonial organizations. The Mojave tribe has an agave clan too. For the record, there is also an agave people living in modern-day Ghana, but its name is a coincidence and not actually tied to this plant. Most plants store energy as starches, but agave stores the energy for all of the significance and all of this utility as complex chains of fructose molecules called fructans. It's the reason Pulque, Mezcal, and Tequila actually exist. But to talk about that, we first need to talk about the drink that made agave infamous and the empire that tried to destroy it. When the European chroniclers encountered agave in the Americas, they struggled to describe it. One called it the Tree of Wonders because it was a plant that provided, quote, water, wine, oil, vinegar, honey, syrup, thread, needles, and 1,000 other things. And when Carl Linnaeus formally classified the genus in 1753, he named it agave from the Greek agave, meaning illustrious or noble. It had been illustrious for about 10,000 years before that, but the name was accurate nonetheless. The drink that made agave sacred we call pulque, or octli in Nahuatl. It's made by harvesting aguamiel, the sweet sap that accumulates in the hollowed-out core of a mature maguey, and allowing it to ferment naturally. The result is a milky, slightly viscous, mildly alcoholic beverage that's sort of like a sour, funky kombucha. It's rich in vitamin C, B-complex vitamins, amino acids, and live probiotics. Pulque has been around for a long time. Researchers analyzed over 300 pot shards from Teotihuacan, the massive urban center that dominated central Mexico, and identified bacteria found in pulque fermentation. Some of the vessels were specialized vessels sealed with pine resin, suggesting organized production and storage, while others were ordinary household pottery. So pulque was both an institutional product and a kitchen table tradition, possibly for over 2,000 years before European contact. But pulque was not a Corona Light at the tiki bar. The Aztecs treated it as a direct conduit to the divine. The resulting intoxication was understood as being possessed by the gods of pulque, Maiawell's 400 rabbit children, gambling with which one was entering the drinker. Were you going to be possessed by the happy-go-lucky rabbit, or the vicious and filled with rage one? Because consuming pulque meant taking the god into your body. Access was strictly controlled. Priests could drink it to communicate with the gods. Pregnant and nursing women could drink it for nourishment. The elderly were also permitted it to moderate what the Aztec medicine describes as accumulated body heat. Warriors and sacrificial victims were also on the approved list. But for everybody else, unauthorized public drunkenness could be punishable by death. The drink held sacred status across multiple Mesoamerican cultures for centuries. And then the Spanish arrived, and they initially attempted to suppress pulque consumption in favor of imported European wines and spirits. To them, a drink that was free, locally produced, nutritionally dense, and culturally sacred to the indigenous population was a direct competition for the colonial alcohol trade. The Spanish framed their suppression, of course, as a moral and religious campaign against indigenous excess, but the economic motive was blatantly obvious. Control the drink and you control the economy. And destroy the drink, you destroy a pillar of indigenous cultural identity. But it didn't work. Pulque persisted as a drink of resistance. Indigenous communities continued to brew it and consume it, and it remained a symbol of native identity throughout the colonial period. To this day, pulque is still produced and consumed in Mexico, though its market share has been eclipsed by beer and spirits. But the Spanish did succeed in one thing. They transformed agave from a subsistence and ritual plant into a commodity by introducing distillation. The how of that introduction is actually debated. Some historians credit Spanish colonizers directly, pointing to European copper still traditions. But others argue that it was Filipino sailors who introduced coconut spirit distillation techniques, and that the clay pots still used in parts of Mexico today descend from that method rather than from European ones. Either way, the collision of indigenous agave management with foreign distillation technology created something new: mezcal. The word mezcal traces directly to the Nahuatl mezcali, cooked agave. To create mezcal, you start by harvesting the piña, the massive carbohydrate-rich part of the plant, and roasting it in underground pit ovens lined with hot stones for days, which converts its complex fructans into fermentable sugars. Then the roasted hearts are crushed, fermented, and distilled. And here's where the pattern starts that should sound very familiar if you've watched the banana episode. Tequila, unlike mezcal, can only legally be made from one species, blue agave. It's grown in monoculture farms across the state of Jalisco, which produces 80% of Mexico's blue agave. By the mid-18th century, haciendas in the Tequila region of Jalisco were cultivating thousands of agaves and running copper stills at an industrial scale. By 1888, the Hacienda Cusillos near Guadalajara was producing the equivalent of 189,000 liters of tequila annually. By 2021, tequila exports had reached a record $3.3 billion, with production up 190% since 2000. The blue agave plants are replicated by cloning offsets from parent plants rather than from growing them from seed, meaning every plant in the field is genetically identical to every other plant. One clone, billions of dollars at stake, and no genetic diversity. If you've subscribed, then you've already seen how this ends. But if you haven't, I'd love to have you here, so please do. But before we get into the monoculture cluster fluff, there's a chemistry story hiding behind that piña that connects the ancient world to the modern one in a way, really, honestly, no one expected. Remember how I said agave doesn't store energy the way other plants do? Now we're diving into that. The carbohydrates packed into that massive piña are fructans, complex polymers of fructose molecules linked together in chains with beta-2,1 and beta-2,5 bonds. That might sound like a minor detail, but it's the reason the entire tequila and mezcal industries exist. And it's the reason modern gut health researchers are very interested in a plant people have been eating for 9,000 years. It's because human digestive enzymes can't break down those fructans. They pass through your stomach and small intestine completely intact, arriving in the colon undigested, where they function as prebiotic fibers. Once there, they feed beneficial gut bacteria, which ferment them into short-chain fatty acids. A randomized double-blind crossover trial confirmed that agave fructan supplementation significantly increased two types of gut bacteria in healthy adults. Animal research has shown that agavins, the specific term for agave-derived fructans, moderate gut microbiota composition, increase short-chain fatty acid production, normalize the Firmicutes to bacteroidetes ratio, a marker researchers associate with metabolic health, and promote weight loss. The mechanism appears to involve two hormones, GLP-1, which slows gastric emptying and signals fullness, and ghrelin, the hunger hormone, which agavins appear to suppress. In one study, mice given agavins ate less, weighed less, and had better blood sugar regulation than controls. And I need to make an important distinction here because the marketing has gotten really messy. Agave fructans are not the same thing as agave syrup or agave nectar. the sweetener that you see in grocery stores. Agave syrup is a heavily processed product in which those complex fructan chains have been broken down into free fructose, typically reaching concentrations of 70 to 90%, which is actually higher than high fructose corn syrup. The American Diabetes Association lists agave syrup as a sweetener to limit, right alongside regular sugar. So when you see a wellness blog promoting agave nectar as a healthy alternative sweetener, understand that they're talking about a fundamentally different product than the intact fructans that research supports. All of that processing destroys what makes it interesting. The roasting process that creates mezcal and tequila sits somewhere in between. When the piña is slowly roasted in those underground ovens for days, the heat breaks down the fructan chains into fermentable sugars, primarily fructose and glucose, which yeast can then convert into alcohol. Beyond fructans, though, agave's chemical profile includes a significant arsenal of steroidal saponins. Researchers have isolated 141 distinct saponins and sapogenins from agave species, and several of them have attracted serious pharmacological attention. The key sapogenins, hecogenin and trigogenin, serve as precursors for the synthesis of certain drugs, meaning that they're used as starting materials in pharmaceutical manufacturing. And saponins extracted from the sap of Agave samiana showed up to 80% cell growth inhibition against HT29 colon cancer cell lines in laboratory testing. 80%. All from the sap of a plant that people have been drinking for millennia. The anti-inflammatory data is just as interesting. Extracts from Agave americana help reduce stomach inflammation by approximately 50% in animal models, and leaf extracts from the same species showed protective effects against paracetamol-induced liver toxicity, which is good to know since acetaminophen overdose is one of the leading causes of acute liver failure in the Western world. And then there's the bone health research, which connects back to those fructans. When agave fructans are fermented by gut bacteria in the colon, it lowers local pH and increases the solubility and absorption of calcium and magnesium. Supplementation with agave fructans prevented bone loss in a very ectomized mice, which is the standard model for postmenopausal osteoporosis, and increased osteocalcin levels by over 50%. Osteocalcin is a protein produced by bone-forming cells and is used as a biomarker for bone formation. A plant that survives in the desert by storing fructose chains instead of starch might also protect our bones through a mechanism that begins in the gut. The Aztecs didn't know about this, obviously, but they did know that agave helped keep people strong. We know that because the Florentine Codex describes agave metal as essential to Aztec medicine. The sap was applied to wounds, the juice was consumed to treat digestive complaints, and the roots were used to relieve joint pain. In Chinese medicine, the plant is known as lang shui lan, literally dragon tongue orchid, and is used for similar anti-inflammatory and detoxifying purposes. So agave's chemistry tells a story that lines up almost perfectly with its cultural history. A plant that was sacred because it sustained communities through everything: drought, famine, celebration, warfare, spiritual practice, turns out to contain compounds that support gut health, bone density, metabolic regulation, and potentially have a cancer treatment. The people who revered it may not have had mass spectrometers, but they had 10,000 years of observational data, and the data was good. The question now is whether the industry built around this plant will honor that legacy or destroy it, because the monoculture trap is already closing. The super premium tequila market, with bottles retailing for, $40 and up, is the fastest growing segment of the spirits industry. Celebrity-backed brands have flooded this space. Global demand is surging, and the entire thing is built on a foundation that anyone who watched the banana episode already recognizes. Blue agave is propagated almost exclusively through hijuelos, which are the clonal offsets that sprout from the base of the parent plant. Growers select the offsets, replant them, and then wait 6 to 8 years for the piña to mature. Every plant in every field is a genetic copy of every other plant. Fusarium, wilt, and other soil-borne pathogens have already devastated blue agave plantations multiple times. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were widespread Fusarium outbreaks that destroyed millions of blue agave plants, caused tequila shortages, and sent the prices skyrocketing. The industry's response was, "You'll be astonished to hear this. Replant the same clone in the same soil, use the same methods too." That sounds familiar. It should. The Gros Michel banana was a single clone grown in monoculture farms across an entire continent until Fusarium wiped it out. The industry replaced it with the Cavendish, another single clone, and Tropical Race 4 now threatens to do the same thing that happened to Gros Michel. The agave industry watched this happen to bananas and is running the same playbook anyway. But the agave monoculture has a second crisis layered on top, and this one involves bats. Agave's primary pollinator in the wild are bats, primarily the lesser long-nosed bat. The bats feed on the nectar of agave flowers and, in the process, pollinate the plants, enabling sexual reproduction and maintaining genetic diversity across wild populations. But here's the problem. Industrial tequila producers harvest their agaves before they flower, because allowing the plant to send up its flower stalk diverts energy away from the piña, reducing the sugar content available for fermentation. More sugar, more tequila, more money, so the flower gets cut. But when you eliminate the flowers, you eliminate the food source that bats depend on, and the bat populations decline. When bat populations decline, wild agave pollination declines. And when wild agave pollination declines, the genetic diversity of the broader agave population shrinks because the only plants reproducing are the clones being replanted by the industry. It becomes this ecological feedback loop that's actively degrading the wild genetic reservoir the industry might need to tap into to save itself. Bat Conservation International launched the Agave Restoration Initiative specifically to address this, working with Mexican farmers and distillers to leave a percentage of agave plants unharvested so that they can flower and feed the bat populations. Some mezcal producers have adopted bat-friendly certification, marketing their product as ecologically responsible. It's a start, and it's one we should commend, but it's still swimming against a tide of economic incentives that reward cutting the flowers before they open. Growers in San Diego County are planting agave alongside vineyards, and the UC Organic Agriculture Institute is developing cultivation guides for the state. Agave's CAM photosynthesis means it requires roughly 90% less water than conventional crops, which makes it increasingly attractive in a state defined by water scarcity. Whether California becomes a major player in agave spirits or remains a niche experiment is an open question. But the fact that the plant is being taken seriously as a crop outside of Mexico is really significant. And since we're not all just booze hounds here, let's talk about the potential happenings outside of the liquor industry. Life cycle analysis of agave biomass as a biofuel feedstock shows 62% lower greenhouse gas emissions than corn ethanol and 46% less water usage. The fibrous bagasse, which is waste left over from the tequila production after the piña is processed, is being converted into bioplastics for straws, cutlery, and cups. A plant that sustained civilizations for 10,000 years might also have a role in addressing the environmental crises of the 21st century, if the industry doesn't destroy the genetic diversity needed to get there. Agave was torn apart and reborn as a plant that gives everything it has for a single act. For over 10,000 years, the civilizations that understood this treated agave with the reverence that kind of sacrifice demands. They domesticated it carefully, maintaining multiple species, preserving diversity, and allowing it to flower and reproduce. But modern demand for more agave means the plants don't get to flower and reproduce, and it isn't completing the cycle that sustained civilizations for all of those years. You can't take everything from a system built on sacrifice and renewal and skip the renewal part, you know? I'm Megan Brame. Thanks for watching. For commentary, ad-free 4K episodes, and bonus content, join me on Patreon. Your support there is what really makes this whole operation possible, and I am so grateful to everyone already there and on YouTube members. If you want another story about a sacred plant that an empire tried to erase from existence, check out the amaranth episode, the grain the Spanish burned to the ground, and the plant behind it that refused to die. Until next time, greenies, stay curious and don't forget to flourish.